Hey guys and gals, so this week we're going to be talking about values. So we're going to look at a value scale here, and we've got a grayscale value scale, and we're going to look at values in terms of gray. You can also talk about values in terms of color, but you really want to start with gray. It's easier to understand, and you can carry that information over into color later on once you start to paint or apply color otherwise with other tools. Now in color here, this is a photograph of a cement sphere, and the color value scale is done with oil pastel. Now you can have more than 9 values. I usually try to teach 9 just to get my students started, but you can definitely have more. Now with this sphere, this is where we get to see where the light is coming from. We have our main highlight. That light fades into what's called the midtone or halftone. That's where you see the true color of an object. Then you have your core shadow, which is the darkest shadow on the object. That light starts to bounce around off of things, and then you have reflective light that bounces back into the objects a lot of times. And then the darkest shadow right underneath the object is called the occlusion. And then you have your cast shadow, which is cast across the floor. Now here, I'm just going through a quick example. I'm going to draw a sphere out. I'm going to use the side of my pencil to quickly shade this in. And at the top, I just showed that you can get plenty of values with just applying the right amount of pressure using your pencil. You don't have to use any crazy tricks. It's just you have to learn how to control the tool and be patient with your process and how much pressure you're applying. So I have my light coming from the top right. I have my highlight fading into the midtones, the mid grays, and then that starts to flow into the core shadow, where kind of light or shadow is getting trapped between light that's coming from up top and light bouncing off of the table or ground back into the sphere. So you have your core shadow, and then you have your reflective light, your occlusion shadow, which is tucked in right underneath the sphere, and then you have your cast shadow. Okay. Now, this is an example of, usually I'll have like maybe Art 2 kids practice this just so they can try different ways of creating their values on a sphere. And so you have blended shading, you have tonal rendering where you don't blend, you just use your tool and how much pressure you're applying. Then you have cross-hatching, squiggly, and textured shading. And so again, highlights, midtones, core shadow, reflective light, occlusion, and cast shadow. I love starting with the spheres to get the kids kind of used to the process, and we can apply that towards more complex shapes. You can start to do life drawing or observational drawing, where you're drawing actual objects that are in front of you or from photos. And again, you take that knowledge, you take the technique, and you start to apply it elsewhere. So you have your highlights, you see it faded into your midtones, and then you start to see your core shadows, the darkest shadows on the object, reflective light, where light's bouncing back, and then occlusion and cast shadows. And from there, you can then take that and use it towards your drawings that you create from imagination, or paintings that you create from imagination. And you can then create some more interesting drawings that maybe have a little bit more dimension to them. Instead of looking so 2D, they start to look a little bit more 3D. Now here I am going to do an observational drawing from a photo of an apple that I took. And so on the apple, you can see the bright spot, that's your highlight, starts to fade into the true color of the apple, which is our midtones or halftones. The dark spot on that apple is the core shadow, darkest spot on the object. And then you can see where reflective light, you can see the light bouncing off the cement back into the apple. But the apple is so shiny that you actually see a reflective shadow on there as well. And then you have right underneath the apple, you have the occlusion and then your cast shadow. And so with this first example, I am using hatching with a little bit of cross hatching to try to get this done. So here, remember, with hatching and cross hatching, I covered this in another video, the closer you put your pencil strokes, the more that you are implying that there's shadow, that there's a darker value there. You kind of spread them out, or you put less pressure on them, you're implying that there's a little bit more light hitting this part of the object. And so I use hatching and cross hatching to kind of create some shadows. You got your core shadows coming into play, you've got your midtones kind of marked in already. I've kind of excluded the highlight areas, kind of left them out, and I'm trying not to touch those as much as possible. And so here I'm working on the reflective light area, or actually there's a reflective shadow because of how shiny this apple is, the surface of the apple. It's actually picking up a little bit of reflective shadow. And so here I'm working on my occlusion, shadow, which is the darkest part right underneath the apple, as it fades off into the cast shadow. Okay, I'm actually got a Kleenex underneath my hand, my palm, because I tend to smudge as I'm working back and forth throughout the drawing. Working with values is a back and forth game. You know, you've got to erase, apply a little bit more. It's really back and forth just so you can try to get your values right. Now here I do another example of this apple, but here I'm using a more of a rendered or blended technique to try to get this apple a little bit more lifelike. And so same concept, and I'm going to use the side of my pencil to quickly block in these values in these areas. I've marked where my areas of coarse shadow, highlight, and midtone and all that go. And so I'm using the side of my pencil because it's very easy to smudge that way. If I use the tip of the pencil, that's a little bit more harsh and it's harder to blend it, and you're kind of carving a divot, this groove into the paper, and you really don't want that sometimes. And so using the side of the pencil works great. It's nice and soft. I can smudge and blend easily. Here I'm using regular tools. I've got a tortillon on hand, or a smudge stick I like to call it. If you don't have something like that, you can easily blend with a Q-tip if you've got it, or Kleenex, even a piece of paper if you got it. I wouldn't recommend using your finger, just because a lot of times we carry a lot of oils in our hands and our fingertips, especially if you ate a bag of chips or something just before you do your drawings, and that oil can carry over and transfer into your drawing, and it really ruins it because it's hard to get that oil out, or it's hard to cover it up, and it just kind of ruins your hard work sometimes. So again, back and forth game, working the values, looking at my reference constantly, comparing the drawing, comparing the reference, seeing what I need to darken. Sometimes the smudging kind of lifts the value, it lightens it up, and so I've got to go back and apply another layer of value, use the eraser, back it up a little bit, darken it a little bit. It really is a back and forth game as you're trying to get as many values as you kind of can. The more values you have, the more realistic it can look, the more three-dimensional. If you only have like 2 values, it's a little bit more on the cartoony side or stylized. And here I start to incorporate a little bit of value on the outside of the apple, and so I use a bit of a reservoir. Sometimes I'll teach my students this, or if your tortillion's already dirty, you can just use that to apply a light value. I use the Q-tip from time to time, apply a light value without having to use the pencil itself. And so you'll see that in a moment where I use my reservoir, there it is, and I use that to dirty up my Kleenex or napkin, and then I apply a nice light value where I need it without being too harsh with the pencil. And then again, it's just a back and forth game. Apply a little bit of value, take a little bit off with the eraser, and get it just right. As many values as we can. Once you kind of get this down, after practicing several times, you'll start to get this down, and you can apply it to your drawings from imagination. So draw from observation, then use that to apply it to your drawings from imagination. You'll start to get a little bit more of a three-dimensional look, no matter what it is you're drawing, and hopefully you'll have some more success. If this helps, let me know. If you want me to cover something else, please put that in the comments down below. And thanks for watching, and don't forget,
if you want more videos like this,
smash that like button and subscribe.